Hello and welcome back to CamBro Conversations. Today's conversation, we're going down the rabbit hole on a particular topic. That topic is creatine, and there's no better man for me to talk to it about than Dr. Darren Candow. Darren, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yes, and we were talking before we hit record about some of the different myths, and that's certainly something that we're going to go into. But I'd love to start a little bit further back than that and understand what it started your interest in researching supplements like creatine.
Yeah, it's interesting. My undergrad degree was in biology, and you go through the first couple of years just taking some basic classes. And then I just happened to take an exercise physiology class as an elective, and I was currently starting to lift weights at the time. And it sort of just all clicked. I had a phenomenal professor, and as you're exercising and you feel the emotions, muscle soreness, you're getting stronger. He really did a great job elaborating and sort of explaining what's happening. And I was hooked ever since. I graduated, applied to grad school, and did my master's and PhD in kinesiology in the area of nutrition and exercise. And we dabbled in amino acids and protein. And that was right around the time where there was probably a decade of research on creatine, and it just seemed to be such a really beneficial compound that a lot of individuals were taking. When you would talk to people, they say, gee, I'm stronger, I've lost increased muscle mass, I feel bigger, stronger, faster. And I was hooked ever since. And so the last 20 years, the primary focus has been on creatine supplementation with and without resistance training across a variety of populations. We're now primarily focused on aging individuals to make these individuals live longer, free of disease. So it's really taken by storm my research program, and I've worked with a lot of great scientists. And to your point, ironically, there's lots of creatine articles, over 1,000, but yet we still have a lot of misinformation out there. And hopefully today we can sort of clarify some of those myths and misconceptions.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting you mentioned there about moving into looking at elderly population, because I see from your email signature that you're working at the moment in the aging, muscle and bone health department at the university. Again, when you think of like supplements, particularly for performance, you do think of young guys like you at your time at university, like myself, who are chasing like muscle gain. But the fact that this supplement that we're going to really discuss is relevant to populations well beyond that, who are just trying to who aren't just necessarily trying to get more jacked. It's very, very valuable that it has application across the board.
Right. Yeah, it's unbelievable. Actually, a special issue came out this year on creatine and health, and we have a virtual conference coming up in a couple of weeks. And there's evidence now that even during pregnancy, the fetus and or the mother can benefit from creatine. Children, adolescents can benefit. There's no adverse effects all the way up to older individuals. So in my opinion, I don't know a person on the planet that would not benefit in some way from creatine supplementation. It's naturally produced in their body, and that's one of the reasons why anybody can take it.
Yeah, that natural production, I think that's interesting, because natural sources is something that I'm always interested in. And I suppose I'd be interested maybe if we start there to understand, where are people naturally getting creatine before they even think about supplementation?
Yeah, it's a perfect introduction. So we naturally produce about 1 to 3 grams, depending on the size of the individual, in processes in our kidneys and liver. But the cool thing is we produce it from 3 amino acids, which is found in all protein-based foods, including plants. So everybody's familiar with arginine, methionine, and glycine. So this is interesting how vegans, vegetarians, or people really emphasizing a plant-based diet, they can still have small amounts of creatine in their muscle or in their body. Of course, if you're on an omnivore diet or even a carnivore diet, you're going to get a lot more through the diet. But even someone eating that will probably only take in about 2 to 3 grams, or maybe a little bit more. So the easy way to look at it is we produce naturally about 1 to 3 grams a day. We excrete about 1 to 3 grams as well. So depending on your diet, that really determines how much is in your body. The downfall, though, is it's extremely difficult to get the amount of creatine through the diet that's needed or been shown to have some muscle and or beneficial effects. And that's probably why most people choose a commercially manufactured product such as creatine monohydrate. You don't need a lot. The minimal dose has been about 3 grams a day. So that's not the loading phase. You don't need the loading phase to get benefits. as little as 3 grams a day is beneficial. We typically do a bit higher, or athletes can do a loading phase if they're looking for that really rapid, accelerated way. So it's something that, depending on the context of what the person's choosing for, there's a variety of strategies and ways to ingest it.
Yeah. So in terms of ingesting it, you spoke about it coming from natural sources like protein based. What's the link then between protein and creatine? Because that's probably creatine's maybe the second most common supplement alongside a whey protein. Where do the two sit in terms of conjunction?
Yep. So the food products specifically that have higher concentrations of creatine are red meat and fatty fish. Mackerel, salmon come to mind. There's trace amounts in poultry as well as milk, but the highest concentrations are in red meat and seafood. So to put it in context, to get about 3 to 5 grams of creatine through food, you'd have to eat 4 salmon steaks a day or 2 red meat steaks. So that's probably not viable for the average person. But from a protein perspective, creatine is not found in any of the plant sources. So that's why individuals have to emphasize either animal or an omnivore diet. It's not really in high concentrations at all in dairy. So that's why we think this is one supplement that just seems to be easier to consume from a commercially manufactured product. It's typically very inexpensive. Now, the issue with COVID, with supplies and some of the restrictions, the price of creatine monohydrate has gone up quite a bit. But compared to other products that probably don't have the evidence-based research and safety profile behind it, it's probably the most effective, inexpensive supplement that you can probably purchase or at least consider.
One of the terms that I always hear banded about with creatine, for those that are advocates of it, like yourself and as I have been for a number of years, is bang for your buck, because it is so heavily researched, and we'll definitely get into some of the research around it, but it's also like so well priced, and it has been, even after this COVID period, it is still an affordable addition when you consider, like you say, somebody might spend a small fortune on something like CBD or magnesium or other supplements, which albeit have some efficacy, not to the same extent that creatine does.
Yeah, the per serving, it ranges anywhere between your currency between 5 cents to 10 cents per serving. And so, that's really inexpensive for what you potentially get from it, for sure.
Where does creatine rank in terms of importance then? Because I mentioned there, one of the most common supplements is whey protein, but when it comes to like actually getting bang for your buck and benefits, where does creatine rank versus other supplements or other things within the body that are going to benefit our performance?
Yeah. That's an important distinction. So obviously protein is an essential macronutrient. Without protein, you would die. You can naturally synthesize creatine from those protein sources. So technically, creatine is not an essential compound at all. People don't take creatine and they have healthy muscles. So it's conditionally essential in certain circumstances if someone has a creatine deficiency syndrome or they're born with deficiencies. So it's a compound. It's kind of like an organic acid or a nitrogen containing compound that has been shown to cause a cascade of things in the body to be turned on. And potentially it just gives more energy to the cell. And if the cell has a higher energy capacity, maybe the muscle can work at a higher volume or can recover at a greater rate. And that seems to be one of the main reasons why people who take creatine or increase it through the diet can gain muscle mass and strength. And that hopefully improves activities of daily living, athletic performance, things like that.
Yes, muscle mass and strength are two of the key benefits, aren't they? And you believe one of the main reasons is somebody's ability to just perform better over time, which of course compounds and leads to muscle gain.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that creatine will increase something called intramuscular creatine in the muscle. So therefore, creatine sort of sacrifices itself and it maintains the energy currency of the cell. So typically the individual lifting weights, performing exercise, they can exercise at a higher intensity, maybe lift heavier weight. And over time, that can lead to some of these processes that can lead to an increase in muscle mass. But one of the biggest myths, of course, is creatine only leads to water retention. And for the listeners, I think the water retention is really important. You actually want that to happen, but the key, though, is it puts water inside the muscle. So it doesn't cause an increase in overall body water retention. It sort of takes water from the bloodstream, goes into our muscle. And a cool thing with cell biology is if you stretch the cell with water or hydration through osmosis, it stimulates all those magic processes that can lead to an increase in protein synthesis. So some things it turns on is satellite cells, transcription factors. It can increase proteins in muscle protein synthetic pathways. But there's a lot of new research suggesting it decreases inflammation and oxidative stress. So it seems to have some anabolic properties, but just as important, it seems to have these anti-catabolic or accelerated recovery processes. So typically when you talk to an athlete or exercising individual who take creatine, they say after a while, they don't notice hardly any muscle soreness, or they're able to recover faster and do multiple training bouts during the week or in the program.
Yeah, terms like anabolic and catabolic, importantly, can we just define our terms there? So anabolic, massively a positive thing. Catabolic, the exact opposite of what we want to do.
Yeah, so anabolic is kind of like growing. So if you're getting an increase in muscle mass and strength, that's more of an anabolic process. Catabolic is sort of decreasing breakdown. So creatine seems to be very unique. It seems to decrease protein breakdown, or it maintains the environment of your muscle to have accelerated recovery. And the other thing is it seems to decrease inflammation. So a lot of people say they suffer, they take Advil or arthritis or things like that. The muscle doesn't like to be in an inflamed environment. It leads to muscle loss or atrophy, especially as we get older. So creatine seems to decrease some properties of inflammation, and that has been shown post-exercise as well. So it seems to have this ability to allow you to exercise or perform at a higher rate, but also recover faster. And that has enormous applications for anybody exercising, not just athletes, to allow that person to be motivated, get back in the gym, basketball court, whatever it is, more frequently.
Yeah, what a deadly combination, both giving with one hand in terms of improving your ability to gain muscle and train hard, but also to recover from that hard training and go again so that you get the ability to get enough frequency, enough protein synthesis, and all these kind of magic terms that we're striving for when it comes to performance improvements.
Yeah, it's very similar to protein. So protein, whey protein, casein, any type of food, it increases protein synthesis. So there's your anabolic environment. And of course, we all know that protein supplementation and weight training lead to greater increases in muscle mass and strength. But protein will also decrease breakdown. So again, very similar, that it creates that more of an anabolic environment for muscle growth and recovery. And there's a few studies that show when you combine creatine and protein, you get even greater increases in muscle mass and strength. So there's something that a lot of people probably play with right now. They might put a bit of creatine in their yogurt or put it in a post-exercise shake, something like that.
Yeah. So combining those two very important supplements or very important food sources or whatever you want to call them is a great way to safeguard performance and future recovery.
Yeah, it's probably the best combination for those processes. I think some people might consider adding in omega-3s as well. There's some evidence in the UK that omega-3s in relationship with protein can have some beneficial effects. But there's not a lot that seem to be proven consistently to have a multifactorial approach. But whey protein and creatine would be right up there from a anabolic, anti-catabolic effect.
Beyond those benefits that we've called out there for people that train, obviously you're doing some work with the elderly population. Reducing inflammation was something that stood out within what you were saying there, because inflammation in the modern age appears to be one of the biggest challenges that people are facing, because we live in a fairly high inflammation environment with our sedentary lifestyles, with our locked inside more than we've been before, as we both talked about before we hit record. That's very, very interesting. So for inflammation, we see a lot of people talk about things like turmeric, curcumin, but creatine has a role to play within that as well.
It's probably the newest merging area. I'm sure we'll talk about bone and, of course, the big one on brain health now, but the anti-inflammatory effects really seem to be emerging and accelerating. And again, with COVID, poor diet, alcohol use, sedentary activity, this all causes inflammation in different parts of the GI tract or the body. But of course, if you can have some anti-inflammatory responses, the body is going to be in a better perspective. And as we get older, usually it starts in the fourth decade, but we get this process called inflam aging, where unfortunately, as we get older with cellular sustenance, our cells can't recover as fast. And therefore, as we get older, we have more inflammation that could lead to arthritis or chronic joint pain. And creatine seems to have some medical or health aspects there for arthritis. We're looking now at bone loss, specifically in postmenopausal women. And we've got a couple papers under review now for brain health, concussion, mild traumatic brain injury. So it's this supplement that used to be created for athletes. In 1992, when Roger Harris did the study and Linford Christie won the gold medal in Atlanta, it's sort of taken off. And then all of a sudden now it's being used by the medical community for therapeutic reasons. Again, I'm not trying to sell the product here, but I'm just trying to give everybody information on the potential beneficial effects. A big thing, though, is the safety profile is second to none. We've done randomized control trials, looked at different dosages. If you're taking the recommended dosage, there's no adverse effects on your liver, kidney, cardiovascular. There's no detrimental effects. And the big reason, just like protein, is naturally produced in the body. So it's not like a compound, like you can take too much caffeine or it's a drug-like compound or a pharmaceutical intervention. But, that powder is derived from 3 amino acids, primarily from plant-based sources. And you're just taking a bit more than what you're naturally consuming.
Yes, and I think that's one of the things that gives people a lot of reassurance when they actually understand about creatine, because it's not as if you're adding this exogenous hormone into your body, which we've used the term anabolic, and I think straight away people think anabolic, they think steroids, and they think, and how many times have we heard over the years, oh, creatine, that's a steroid. It's crazy because while it's got anabolic properties, it's not in the same league when it comes to the potential impact that we could have. It has a massive positive impact, but it's very different from injecting large amounts of maybe.
Yeah, I mean, the analogy with anabolic, you're right. I mean, I guess you could just say increasing. You take a carbohydrate meal, you get an increase in glycogen. That's technically anabolic to the muscle. You break down glycogen when you're running, that's catabolic. So it just depends on the deciphering of the products. But the funny thing with creatine, and this is important and surprising to me, it's never been shown once to increase the rates of protein synthesis. So protein has consistently been shown to increase the rates of myofibrillar or muscle protein synthesis, but all those studies have never been shown creatine to do it. So it sort of acts a little bit differently than protein. It sort of targets a bunch, about 6 or 7 different other factors that are involved in creating bigger and stronger muscles. But surprising to me, and maybe it just hasn't been discovered yet, it's never been shown to increase the rates of protein synthesis directly. It sort of indirectly causes a whole bunch of other things to happen.
Interestingly, when we're talking about the benefits of protein there versus creatine acting slightly differently, when we're thinking about supplementation, it's good. Like, I think an important point you raised earlier was that there's almost no way that you can get enough creatine from your diet, whereas we all know that should you not have access to whey protein, you would just have to eat more protein from whole food sources, and that is attainable. Whereas you would have to probably shift your diet quite radically to get in enough creatine from red meat or salmon.
Yeah, we don't the funny thing is in theory, and this is theoretical, like the muscle of the average person only has a ceiling to the amount of creatine that can be saturated into the muscle. And once it's saturated, you only need a small amount per day. But you can do it through your diet, but you would have to eat meat on a daily basis to get an excessive amount. And from an ethical standpoint, financial, or people pushing the plant-based diets for health reasons or vegetarians specifically, it's probably just easier to look at a supplement. But a lot of people say, I don't want to take any supplements. I say, that's totally fine. Here's some food choices that you would have to eat more. Can you live a healthy life without supplementing or increasing dietary creatine? Absolutely. People have been doing it before we discovered creatine, but we do know you need a small amount. And again, the minimal dose shown to be effective is about 3 grams a day. And it takes about 28 days before you saturate the muscle. So again, you don't necessarily need the loading phase, which is very common for athletes. You can take a small amount and not worry about it. It's one of those things that accumulates over time, and you'll eventually get some benefit, either performance, brain, cognition, whichever it is. You will probably get some benefit somewhere down the line.
Yes. Before we head towards bone health and brain performance, which really, really interests me, you've mentioned there about loading and dosages. Yes. I think that's one of the things that I see quite a lot of, particularly from people who are maybe incentivized financially. They talk about this loading phase, and they talk about cycling on and off. Can you just address what that means and why it might be beneficial, but also why it might not be?
Yeah. So as it currently stands, research indicates about 4 different ingestion strategies that seem to be effective. So I think the most popular is the loading phase that you talked about. And this is where you consume 20 grams a day. So that would be 4 5-gram dosages, maybe breakfast, lunch, dinner, and a snack. You do that for about 5 to 7 days. That was the first strategy ever designed, and it's extremely rapid and effective. So the most effective way to saturate or really get creatine into the muscle is this loading phase. The downfall with this is it can lead to rapid water or weight gain, and it can cause some GI tract irritation because you're taking in such a high volume. So a lot of people say, geez, I tried this, I didn't like it. A second phase is the ones we commonly use, is based on the size of the person. So we use 0.1 gram per kilogram. So if you're 70 kilograms, you get 7 grams a day. If you're 100 kilograms, you get 10 grams a day. The theory there is that the larger the person, they have more doorways in the muscle called creatine transporters. So in theory, a larger person may need more creatine per se than someone smaller. It's very similar to caffeine. The third dose is the lowest. It's 3 grams a day. You just take a half a teaspoon after your workout in the morning, wherever, and away you go. And it takes about 30 days to saturate the muscles. Overall, from a global perspective, the most common recommended you'll often hear is just 5 grams a day. And people say, where the hell did you ever get 5 grams a day? Well, it's based on the 3-gram minimal dose. We produce about 2 grams a day in the kidneys and liver, and or get through our diet, but we also pee out or excrete about 2 grams. So if you take 2 grams synthesized plus the 3 gram from supplement and you excrete 2, there's your 3 gram. That seems to be the minimal dose. Those are the 4 strategies that seem to be very effective. Of course, you can try other alternatives, whichever you work. But for any of the listeners, if they say, I've tried creatine and I sort of get some GI tract irritation or whatever, I say, no problem. Break it up into 1 or 2 gram dosages multiple times a day. The less quantity, you'll probably be able to absorb it better or be able to retain it more. 100% gets in the bloodstream regardless. So it just depends how you want to get there.
That loading phase, so the first strategy, interests me a lot because that's the one that I think you see marketed the most.
Yes.
Obviously, it's maybe advantageous for somebody to sell that volume of it. And equally, if a lot of athletes that you've maybe researched into have adopted that approach, that's who you're looking at as the peak performer in terms of who you want to replicate. Even if you're somebody that's not looking to reach that level of performance, you admire their traits and you admire their performance and you want to go towards that. However, as you've said, I know one of the common complaints is the potential for water retention. And we've spoken there about the water retention actually being a positive thing. However, initially for body image, for adherence, for just comfort in terms of how you look, but also how your GI tract and your digestion is going, it has some significant downsides for the everyday person. And you can still, as you've explained with the other 2 or 3 strategies that are available, you can still reap the benefits without maybe the discomfort if you found that is uncomfortable. So that initial week, I think it's a lot more interesting if you were to consider a loading phase to do some of the calculations that you've done, because in the same way with effective dose for caffeine, effective dose for protein intake, we base that on body weight, whereas outside of that, everyone's always just based it on 5 grams is what you need, but your loading phase needs to be 20 grams or 7 grams or whatever the magic number was.
Yeah, and that's a good point. So after the loading phase, it's usually recommended to reduce it to a minimal maintenance phase, maybe that 3 grams or 5 grams a day. But we've seen a lot of individuals, primarily females, they're very hesitant to take creatine because of the weight gain in the first week or so. And so I immediately titrate it down to a smaller dose, and it's easier absorbed and leads to less water retention. So for the athlete or the individual saying, I'm going to take this for the health benefits for years and years and years, do the small dose. You're going to get the same benefits. It's only for those athletes who say, geez, I just found out I qualify for the world championships or some big event. I really need to rapidly saturate the muscle. They're probably not caring about the water retention. And to the other point, if there's more water in the muscle, that decreases dehydration stances. Other people think creatine is a diuretic. No, it hyperhydrates the muscle. So you actually get less muscle cramping and things like that. But I think if anybody that's going to be listening will say, geez, I don't really respond, or I respond too much to water retention, just decrease that dose multiple times a day or once a day. 2 or 3 grams a day probably is going to be the minimal amount in combination of your diet, and you can get some beneficial effects for sure.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly reassuring and actionable for people, because I was saying before we record that there's the kind of magic conversation that people don't hear. And I was saying that the community at CamBro Conversations are very respectful of the science and they want to hear the information. But when you deliver it in such a way, and that's why whenever I get an academic on, it's always an academic that I really like in terms of their ability to say, well, this is what you do in practice, not just this is what we did with this research study, and you should all think about this. It's a case of, well, this is what we did with this research study, but we also know that for the everyday population, this is a good approach as well, and this is how it works. So no, a huge fan of that. Cycling on and off then. So if I've done my loading phase and then I scale back down to my 5 grams a day every day, how long can that continue? Do I need to cycle off? Is that a myth?
Yeah, so the question is, do you need to cycle creatine? The answer is 100% no. Now, this is important. No study has ever shown a difference between continuous daily creatine and creatine cycling for a longer period of time to see if one is giving you any greater benefits than another. And that's a study we do have planned, but there's some methodology issues that take a while. And here's the reason why. If you saturate the muscles with creatine, either through the diet, endogenous production in the body, and or supplementation, if you suddenly stop, you're still naturally synthesizing it every day because you're eating protein and you're still excreting it. But it takes about 4 weeks before those elevated muscle creatine stores to come back to baseline levels before you started the supplement. So that was where the theory of creatine cycling said, hey, once my muscle was saturated, I don't want to desensitize the muscle to the supplement. Maybe I'll stop. Maybe since those gains are elevated for 4 weeks, I'll just come right back to baseline. The cool thing is there's no evidence to suggest you need to cycle it. You still get continuous benefits. We've done randomized control trials where creatine was consumed on a daily basis for 2 straight years. No side effects, and these individuals benefited across a variety of populations. So it's up to the person. If they want to take it for a while, take some time off. Just note, if you do stop taking it, and the muscle is saturated, which is easy to do, the benefits last at least 4 weeks. At least 4 weeks. So you're not going to deflate. You're not going to come back to baseline immediately. And that's one of the cool things with this. Creatine is trapped in the muscle once it gets in there. It's really tough to get out. So if your muscles are fully full of creatine, it takes a long time, and on average, at least 4 weeks. But more research is suggesting it might even be longer than that. So there's a huge benefit to that.
That's quite exciting, because if we think back to, and I'm not sure what the situation is in all across Canada, but if we think back to when the gyms were closed at the start of the first lockdown, a lot of people panicked about, am I going to lose my gains? Yes. And we had an initial three weeks that turned into 6 months of gym closures in Scotland. So of course, if you didn't train for 6 months, yes, you were going to lose some of your gains if you didn't train to the same level. However, a lot of people were panicking that 3-4 weeks was going to be devastating, and there was so much information at the time in terms of keeping moving, adequate protein. But a factor within that probably would be, if you're still saturating your muscles with creatine, you could hold on to more of your muscle and your tissue just without training, based on the fact that that supplement is playing an active role in your body still maintaining that muscle mass.
Yeah, we did a couple studies with immobilization. So mimic, well, God forbid, another pandemic down the road, but this is areas of fractured limb, bed rest, immobilization, and creatine decreased the rate of muscle and strength loss. So it's maintaining the integrity of the cell to help maintain some of that muscle mass. So for the athletes who break a limb or bed rest, or God forbid, a shut in or inactivity because of COVID, creatine could, and I would recommend to take still on a daily basis, even when they're not working out, because you get so many other benefits potentially in brain health. It's one thing to take on a daily basis, kind of like a vitamin, if they will. And it seems to have some beneficial effects, even independent of physical activity.
Yeah. So that cycling myth has probably been addressed there. So there isn't a need to cycle off, but if you did have a pause in it, you're not going to lose the benefits of it for a period of time. And you can just start back up either with a loading phase if you wanted to, or you just carry on with your standard dosage.
That's correct. Yeah. And I think the 4-week or 28 days seems to be a window. If you went 6 weeks or so, that would be fine too. And then you start back up and then you sort of summate or accumulate quicker. Yeah.
I said we'd put a pin in brain health and bone health. Let's talk a little bit about bone health first of all. What's some of the information coming out of that, particularly in the department that you're working in at the moment, the lab?
It's an area of major focus for us, and a colleague I have at close proximity to me as well. It's a small body of research, but what it stands right now in consensus is that creatine supplementation and resistance training can have some bone beneficial effects. It's primarily in postmenopausal females. And what we're seeing is that it can potentially decrease the rate of bone mineral loss in the hip region, which is really important for potentially increasing the strength of the bone around or preventing hip fracture and replacement. But just this year, we put out a really nice study using a CT scanner, and creatine increased muscle density and trabecular bone area in the lower part of the leg. So around the ankle or muscles around the ankle, this could have an implication for preventing falls and subsequent fractures. This was in older individuals, 15 above. But a really cool thing is we're not seeing a lot of benefit or hardly any research in younger individuals, probably because their bone density is strong and not really susceptible to issues yet. But as it currently stands, the minimal dose shown to have any bone beneficial effects is much higher than muscle. So this is an important distinction. For the bone, which requires creatine for energy, the minimal dose shown to have some bone effects is 8 grams a day during a resistance training program. So this is important. Muscle, 3 grams, 5 grams, whichever. It seems if you want an increase in bone density, and primarily if you're in a population susceptible to bone loss or things like that, 8 grams a day is the lowest dose shown to be effective right now.
That's so interesting, because if as you age, bone health becomes more of a risk for you, adjusting your dose based on that is just such valuable information. It's great that we're doing research in that kind of field to understand how to support those people, because in the UK in particular, we have an older population, a more frail population, a more obese population as well. So if you have breaks and falls, you're putting more weight through these bones than before as well. So I find it very interesting that that sort of research is available to that population, although unfortunately a lot of the people that would benefit from that kind of information might be switched off to other health advice that we're trying to share with them.
It's so interesting because that sort of opened the debate. Is it's the same as dietary protein? So at a young age, you only need about 0.25 grams per kilogram, or about 20 to 30 grams to maximize the rates of protein synthesis. But some of your listeners probably heard of this anabolic resistance. As we get older, we have a blunted response to exercise and protein. And we used to tell older individuals you need less protein per meal because you're maybe not as active. And then that was completely opposite. Stu Phillips and Luke Van Loon and all these great protein researchers clearly shown that the dose of protein per meal is almost double in older individuals to get the same response. So I'm starting to wonder, maybe older individuals need twice as much creatine per serving or day. So we have a graded creatine dosing study plan once COVID is over to look at high dose versus moderate to lower dose. And maybe older individuals might benefit more consistently with a higher dose, probably because they're going through all this transition where they might require a higher energy status of the cell.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. On to the other topic, and this particularly interests me because a lot of the people that listen to the podcast are what I term as office athletes. So like me, they have a corporate job, but they're pursuing peak performance both within their career and their business, but also within their kind of the actual training and their performance. So what impact can creatine have on how well what's going on in these top 4 or 5 inches is?
Yeah, the neck above has become the hottest topic with creatine. And we have a great paper in review, and hopefully it's going to be published here soon. And God, where do I start? So it's an emerging area. And so the cool thing is we've always taken creatine for our muscle, but little did you know that it was a small amount of that was accumulating in the brain. About 95% of our creatine that we take are synthesized in our skeletal muscle, but about 5% or less is dispersed over the brain, testes, and bone tissue. So there is some good evidence now that in rodent as well as in humans, which is really exciting, that creatine supplementation, as little as 5 grams a day, but we think you need more, and I'll explain why, has been shown to increase brain creatine content. And just like all our cells, all the cells in the brain use creatine for energy and recovery. So it's been shown to have promise for mild traumatic brain injury, concussion. Sleep deprivation is something that's really emerging, especially for students. It seems to increase cognition, memory. It has some equivocal benefits for neurodegenerative diseases. Some studies will show a benefit for Parkinson's and Huntington's, and some don't. I think more long-term care needs to be there. But the neck above is probably for the next 10 years the main area of focus, and it seems to have some benefit. Two things that distinguish the brain versus the skeletal muscle. Unlike skeletal muscle, which does not make its own creatine, the brain does. So it's a little resistant to what's in the diet or supplementation. And our blood-brain barrier doesn't like to take in creatine because it's naturally being made. And cells of our body or in the brain lack the doorway or the transporter. So there's a theory among some researchers to suggest that unlike muscle, you may need more creatine per day and longer to really significantly benefit or accumulate in the brain tissue.
Okay, so it might be pushing towards that 8 grams, maybe more than that, to have an effect on brain performance. Okay. How did we start to understand that it was improving cognition and brain function then? What was the studies that were taking place?
Yeah, they started to just look at the bioenergetics of brain tissue and say, geez, creatine is a metabolite that really seems to be highly turned over in brain tissue. And under times of metabolic stress, concussion, mild traumatic brain injury, sleep deprivation. I can't even imagine the mental stress on a global perspective with COVID. And so how can this help heal or recover or decrease inflammation in the brain, which could have huge ramifications? So that you're going to see a lot more clinical trials coming out with that. But if you're just taking creatine, maybe the loading phase, it could increase brain creatine content. But I think from a cognitive or neck above health perspective, it's kind of one of those things you might look on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I was intrigued to hear you use the term inflammation again there, because when it comes to brain health, and you were talking about degenerative diseases, inflammation is one of the biggest challenges we face. So if creatine responds in the same way that it does to your muscles in terms of reducing inflammation after training and improving recovery, if that can be facilitated within the brain with the right dosages, and I don't know, whatever, maybe we have to adapt the exact type of product or whatever it is, that could be unbelievable when it comes to the fight against people's brain faculties leaving them in their elderly.
There was a study about 25 years ago, actually, about people with gyrate atrophy. It's sort of atrophy of the eye muscles and the nerves around that. And creatine really improved the longevity and the health. So we always think of the brain, but there's other areas of the neck up as well. So when you look at the totality of evidence, it seems that it's an overall body nutrient. Again, we naturally produce it. We're probably synthesizing it from most of our foods we're consuming. Most people probably take it from a supplement, but it can have a lot of beneficial effects.
Excellent. From the data then, are there any people that don't respond to creatine, or does everyone do well from using this?
Yeah, so it's an excellent question. So most people classify it as responders or non-responders. So let's start with the non-responders. Some people say, hey, I've tried this creatine stuff. I don't notice any effect. And it's primarily based on 4 categories. You will respond to creatine based on the initial amount you have in your muscles, your age, if you're male or female, or the type of muscles you have. So let's go back to the initial amount. If you're eating a lot of red meat and seafood per week, you will probably not respond nearly as well as someone who has low amounts, vegan, plant-based, or vegetarian. So a vegetarian will respond phenomenally well to creatine because they have hardly any amounts in the muscle. Second is age. As we get older, we typically don't eat a lot of red meat. We're not very active, or we have some other process called inflammation. So older individuals seem to respond very favorably to supplementation, maybe because of a combination of those effects. Males and females respond very favorably as well to creatine, but males will respond a bit better from a muscle breakdown perspective. Again, males seem to not experience the same rate of muscle protein breakdown as females. We're not sure if it's estrogen related, but again, both will get an increase in muscle mass, strength, and performance. And the fourth one is type 2 muscle fibers. These are our biggest muscle fibers. Unfortunately, we start to decrease those as we get older. So again, if we can maintain exercise, primarily resistance training, that's the driving force. Creatine is kind of like an icing on the cake, same as protein. You still need to exercise, and you might get a small greater benefit with supplements.
Yeah, amazing, Darren, because I was thinking there that I've seen people say like, oh yeah, I've used creatine, I didn't see the benefits, I just felt bloated, or whatever terminology they wanted to use. So it's interesting that there are certain demographics that will immediately see a benefit just off the back of it. And I think it's the same as a lot of things. If you add in something to somebody's life that's a positive, where they've maybe had so many negatives,
yes,
then it becomes like this magic pill. Whereas if you are nailing the basics, it might give you that extra percentile to improve, particularly over the longer term. So if I was supplementing with creatine while smashing my training and my sleep, my recovery, and all these different things, I might not notice that it's making me like all of a sudden considerably better, but it will be making me better in some regard.
100%. And we've always taken it from a phenotypical outward appearance perspective, but it was having beneficial effects to your cell and brain cell and certain things. So maybe it's causing some health beneficial effects. You just don't see it in the mirror. So it's one of those things to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the myths that I'd love to explore with you are, well, maybe they aren't myths, but what is said when it comes to creatine in kidneys? Because we've kind of talked about it not being a steroid, but people talk about, oh, that'll destroy your kidneys.
Yeah. So the number one myth in probably all sport nutrition exercise is proteins, high protein diet will kill your kidneys. And that's 100% myth, just like creatine. We're seeing no evidence whatsoever that creatine within any recommendations, which we've talked about, will have any detrimental effects on your filtration rate, renal or liver function. If anything, we see some improvements in kidney function with creatine. It can be considered an essential nutrient for people with dialysis and things like that. So it makes those processes work a little bit more. But as you take in creatine, you're probably going to get an increase in something called creatinine, and that's a metabolic byproduct. It's just going to leave the muscle, enter your bloodstream. So sometimes you go to your doctor, get blood work, and you say you have high creatinine levels. That can indicate one thing: impaired kidney function, but more than likely, actually pretty much all the time, it's just an indication that you're taking elevated amounts of dietary and or supplementation of creatine. And then of course your kidneys just filter that out. So that's what we consider a myth. Even in rare circumstances, it has no detrimental effect on liver or renal function.
Yeah, an important piece of reassurance there. Now, the second one that springs to mind for me is hair loss. A lot of guys have a level of concern about taking creatine because they say, won't that make me go bald?
Yeah. The number one question I get every day, and of course, if I look in the mirror, I'm not the biggest proponent of it for sure. And surprisingly, most of our creatine researchers are follically challenged, but it all stems from that single study in Australia with rugby players. And it's so ironic that you could say creatine just cured cancer, and the first question you get is, I thought it caused hair loss. That's all people care about. And it's a viable concern in question. So really it stems from that one study where they took young rugby players. It was a small sample size, and they gave them creatine supplementation, a loading phase for 7 days, and then a higher amount, a maintenance phase. And they just let them go train just like normal and play their sport. And they noticed that when the young males took creatine, they got an increase in a hormone called DHT, or dihydroxytestosterone. And the link here is testosterone is converted from an enzyme to DHT. And of course, DHT is highly linked to follicle shrinkage and follicle death. So immediately the analogy was, well, if you get an increase in DHT, that's going to lead to hair loss. Little has been explained or deciphered in the article. The increase was well within the range of normal physiological health. And there was no measure of follicle thinning or hair loss. So the way I like to preface this is, you can do a bout of resistance training and you can get an increase in some type of hormone, free testosterone, insulin-like growth factor. That does not mean or correlate absolutely anything to muscle mass over time. So just by doing an increase in a hormone, which is still within normal physiological ranges, a lot of people said, well, it guarantees it leads to hair loss. It's never been shown, never been done. And ironically, resistance training, which they were doing, can increase DHT as well. So the bottom line is, no study has ever been shown that creatine leads to hair loss. No study has ever been shown that it doesn't. but we have no evidence to suggest that you will get a decrease in hair loss or lead to balding. But some people are anecdotally saying, hey, I stopped taking creatine, my hair came back, whichever. As it stands right now, there's never been a study that's actually measured hair loss.
Yeah, and I think it's very important that, given the years of research that you've done, the thousands of studies that we've got around creatine, that if there was this really strong correlation and link, we would almost definitely have at least a handful of studies that gave a really strong opinion either way on this. So,
and we always encourage, to any research participant, and any researcher should do this, is encourage, like, feel free to report side effects or anecdotal effects. We've done studies up to 2 years in duration, and not a single time has someone said, hey, I think I'm losing my hair. I think my hair is thinning, males or females across the age spectrum. And if you look at the average length of training, 6 weeks to maybe 32 weeks, not a single study has ever said, and one of the side effects reported was hair loss, not a single one. So I think there's no reason to suspect it leads to hair loss. I think it just happened that that hormone was elevated, and people say, well, there's correlation, and we all know that's not causation. And so to that point, not a single paper that I've read has said one of the side effects reported was hair thinning or loss. And
yeah, certainly. If you're talking about a 32-week study, as young guys, and I know from discussing with friends and even from my own experience, if you experience thinning of your hair, you would notice it across the 32-week period, where noticeably each time you went to the barbers every 5-6 weeks, you'd be like, oh, wow, like my hairline's getting higher here, or I'm noticing some recession around my crown. Like, that would be noticeable, and you would absolutely raise that with somebody within a study as something you noticed within that period, because it would be different from when you were not part of the study.
100%. You notice your hair falling out immediately, just the texture of it, washing your hair. And again, it's never been shown, never been a reported side effect. And I definitely think research participants would let you know for sure if that was a side effect. We always encourage it, because I think determining the safety profile of a compound is just as important, if not more important, than the efficacy. And we're not seeing any evidence that it causes hair thinning or baldness.
Darren, we spoke about responders versus non-responders. Are there any groups where it's advised that they don't take creatine? So, for example, when I was Googling in preparation for this, somebody had said teens might not take it because it might stunt their growth. Is that the case? Like, are there any groups that you say, oh, maybe best that you don't have creatine until you're a certain age, or maybe best that you just don't have creatine at all?
Yeah, there's always caution when we look at individuals under the 18, because there's a small body of research. But in the minimal amount of studies that have looked at creatine in youth and adolescents, we only see positive effects and no detrimental adverse effects whatsoever. Those studies are limited. They've never looked at any cellular or like internal biomarkers like blood and urine per se. But when you look at the data, there's no adverse effects reported. In boys with muscular dystrophy, it's been shown to have enormous beneficial effect. But from a non-clinical population, we're not seeing any reason why basically anybody on the planet, I'm not seeing any reason why someone can't consider it. There's always a bit of caution, but more research is emerging. But again, it's naturally being produced. It's kind of like saying to a young individual, you shouldn't eat protein. We don't know how you would decipher that. And that's why creatine will never be banned on the IOC. It's naturally produced. It's not a synthetic compound that you're taking like a caffeine or a hormone.
Exactly. And those teens are eating creatine anyway. So
yeah, exactly.
There we go.
Yeah, it's one of those things. And there's more research. Andrew Yagam and Chad Kursick in the United States do a lot of work in younger individuals, and their review papers are very elegantly detailed and very cautious. And they always conclude we don't see a reason that they can't. And we certainly don't see a reason suggesting that it's going to cause any harm within recommended dosages. Yeah.
My last practical question for you, Darren, is around timing. Is there a preferred time to take it?
Stole my thunder. We're literally writing the paper now to sort of put a nail in the coffin on this. So the theory here, and it came back to a seminal study by Roger Harris in 1992, the first one, and that he simply showed that if you do prior muscle contractions, so picture weight training, that seemed to increase uptake of creatine into the muscle. So a lot of people said, well, if I do resistance training, that increases either blood flow or transport kinetics. It seems to increase more creatine in the muscle. And if you get more creatine in the muscle, it unlocks the magic of all those pathways. So people said, well, the timing is crucial, just like the myth around the timing of protein. So as it stands right now, and again, there's a lot of published papers on this, when you look at creatine before you work out, compared to creatine after, there's absolutely no difference. You have the luxury of taking creatine before exercise. You have the luxury of taking creatine after. We've done the only study to look at creatine during. The individuals would take a sip of creatine after every set. That was very beneficial for improving strength and compared to placebo. And then there's been a few studies that have looked at creatine in the morning versus in the evening. No differences. So bottom line is you can probably take creatine anytime during the day. You do get beneficial effects if you take it around resistance training sessions, but no study has compared morning versus pre-exercise, during and post to evening, and we have those planned. But as it stands right now, unlike caffeine, which is a stimulant within 60 minutes, I think if you take creatine in any day that you're training, including resting days, you will accumulate in the muscle and get the beneficial effects. We're not seeing any difference before, after, whichever it is. So we think this is a non-issue. Just take creatine if you're willing to take it, but make sure you work out. That's the driving factor. The magic of exercise seems to unlock the potential of creatine.
Amazing. And I think for me, adherence is number one. So remembering, for example, if I take it with my other supplements in the morning, which is when I do take my creatine, great. If you have to put it in your shake that you have after your workout, or do you have a shake at your desk when you're doing a particular task during your working day, then as long as it's built into your day and you don't miss your 3 grams, your 5 grams, or whatever you're on during your loading phase, then that's the most important thing, rather than trying to time it within this perfect window where you're going to make an extra kilo of muscle gain this month if you do it.
And so this is a lead in, and you probably were going to go here, but creatine and caffeine. So this is a dangerous area, or people think it's a dangerous area. So this is an important distinction, that some of the most cellular evidence has suggested that creatine and caffeine don't like each other. They oppose each other regarding calcium. So the minimal studies that have looked at, does caffeine and creatine interfere with each other? The theory is if you do the loading phase of creatine and then you take an acute dose of caffeine. So for example, if you load a creatine for 3 or 4 days, and then on Friday you said, I have a cycling time trial, I'm going to take a high dose of caffeine, a coffee, like 300 grams. They seem to have a synergistic effect. There's no detrimental effect. What does seem to be effects is if you take creatine loading and simultaneously ingest caffeine at the same time, they seem to interfere with one another. So the theory is that they cause some GI tract irritation, or what's more likely is that there's some opposition. So we've done the only study this year where I said, okay, that's only for a specific population. What about people who just weight lift? We've all heard of these pre-workout supplements or caffeine and creatine. And lo and behold, although the sample size was substantially halted and limited by COVID, we were able to get enough to do some statistical analysis. And in the group who took creatine alone during 6 weeks of training, they got a significant increase in muscle size. But lo and behold, the same individual group who took creatine and caffeine together in a powder, they did not get the same increase. So it looked like the caffeine kind of blunted the effects of creatine. Again, really small sample size, but it's sort of, when you look at the accumulating evidence, my suggestion is to do pre-exercise caffeine, post-exercise creatine, or take your creatine maybe a few hours before you're going to work out. And then, as we all know, within an hour, caffeine leading up to it. I don't think we're sure if you combine the two directly, if you put your creatine in tea or coffee, would it totally negate? But there is some suggestion to suggest it could. So why not just be a little err on the caution and split those up as much as possible?
Yeah, that's a very practical recommendation, again, to split them away from each other, because if there is any potential negative, it shouldn't affect your daily routine too much. And once you build the habit of when you're going to take either of those, and we know that caffeine's probably a bit more regimented in terms of when you probably need to take it. Let's move your creatine to another time in the day when you can benefit from it.
And for most pre-workouts, if they do have caffeine and creatine, Remember, they have a ton of other compounds, so we don't know which one is really adding or negating the other. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Darren, I've absolutely loved this conversation. Where should people head towards if they want to continue the conversation with you and learn a little bit more?
Yeah, the probably easiest is on Instagram. My handle is at Dr. Darren Candow. More than happy to follow or for people to follow me or be in contact, direct message me if they have any questions. And that seems a place with all new research. We usually post it there first. Of course, Twitter handle as well. So those social media seems to be the area to look at, but Instagram would be the most advantageous.
Excellent. Both Instagram and Twitter will be linked in the show notes below. I'm sure you've all enjoyed that one. If you have done, take a screenshot, pop on your Instagram story, tag me at call.cambro, and I'll be back to speak to you all again very, very soon.